Very good. Perfect. So today, as I said, we are going to approach a particular mitzvah that has both customs and has halachot regarding this mitzvah. And what I would like to try to do today is to combine both the background for the mitzvah, the meaning of the mitzvah, as well as the particular customs, as well as halachot and tfilot that are connected to this mitzvah. So the meaning behind it, the customs, the practices, and the prayers as well. So please keep, I hope that you all have a pen and paper at hand in order to be able to follow, but this will also be recorded, and as I said, we'll send a summary as well. So let us begin. Our subject today is Rosh Chodesh, literally meaning Rosh is the head or the beginning, right? Chodesh is the month. So we have 12 months. It's not to be taken for granted, right? That we have 12 months. And we're talking about the lunar cycle. We're basically what we have now, for example, the upcoming month that we have right now, we're finishing the first Adar, and we will soon begin. This week will be Rosh Chodesh on Thursday and Friday, and we're going to discuss that as well. We have 2 days of Rosh Chodesh, which will be this coming Thursday and Friday, and they will be Rosh Chodesh Adar Bet. They will be the beginning of the month, of the second month of Adar. It's a unique case in which we have 2 of the same month. We have an additional month added, which we will also discuss a bit. We won't get into all of the details. But before we go into the details of Rosh Chodesh itself, just to make it simple, the beginning of each lunar month, we have 12 lunar months. The months' names are mostly names that are not Hebraic, that are not written in the Tanakh, but they came from surrounding cultures, but that they were implemented into the Jewish calendar. The 12 months that we have run from Tishrei until, run from Nisan, okay, until the next Nisan, until the end of Adar, okay? Tishrei, that was the next sentence I was going to say, that we're used to thinking is the beginning of the year. So we have Rosh Hashanah, okay, and this is already, I see it's a bit complicated, but we have Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of the year. We have a yearly cycle that we count. When does this year start? 5782 began on Rosh Hashanah, but the beginning of the month actually begins in Nisan, and we will see the psukim, and that is directly correlated to the fact that this is when the Jewish people were created, when they left Egypt in the month of Nisan. Nisan is, so in that sense, is the first month. We don't have that name in the Torah itself, but if we look at the psukim that we will soon see, we will see that this is, we can call it month number 1. So the first month is the first lunar month is Nisan, okay? And then we have 12 months altogether. What is, just if you calculate, we have any mathematicians here, and you calculate the lunar month, which is 29 days, around 29 days, the cycle of the month is around 29 days. So if you calculate that times 12, you will not end up with 365. So we have a difference of about 11 days between the solar cycle and the lunar cycle. Is everyone with me until now, or is this already becoming complicated? We're okay, okay? So we have 354 days, which is 12 times around 29 is the lunar cycle of the months. Why is it important, and what is the connection or the correlation between the solar and the lunar? We already see in Bereshit from the beginning when Hashem created the sun and the moon on the fourth day, and we're going to see that as well. But what is also interesting is that Rosh Chodesh is actually the first mitzvah that is given to the Jewish people as a mitzvah. If you ask yourself, what is the first mitzvah? Then many, sorry, I'm getting phone calls. I have to put myself in flight mode. There. Okay. So Rosh Chodesh is the first mitzvah, which means one might think, okay, what is the first mitzvah? We respect our parents, to love God, to fear God. All of those come later in the Aseret HaDivrot, in the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. The first mitzvah, which is given as a collective mitzvah to the Jewish people as a people, is when they become a people. And when do they become a people? When they are first leaving Egypt, when they have to make a distinction between themselves and the Egyptians. They do so with the Pesach lamb, and in order to set the calendar to have a distinctive Jewish calendar, so already then at that time, the Jewish people begin counting, and that is a mitzvah which is given to them. Helena, I need to be able to share my screen if possible. So from the beginning, an interesting question, a philosophical question that one may ask is, why is it, why does, if the book of the Torah is given to the Jewish people as a book of the Jewish people of telling us what to do, so one might actually think that where should the Torah start? It shouldn't start with Bereshit. It shouldn't start with the story of creation, because that's about mankind, that's about the world. Whereas the Midrash says, or asks the question, actually, the Torah should have started with the first mitzvah. So, and that's where we see that the first mitzvah which is given is the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. The first Rashi, the first commentary in the entire Torah, on the beginning of Bereshit, on the first word, Rashi says the following: the Torah, which is the law book of Israel, should have commenced with the verse, "This month shall be unto you the first of the month," which is the first commandment to Israel. In other words, we see that from the beginning, we won't go into the commentary of why it is that we have Genesis at all and what are the answers that are given to it. But the point is that already from the first commentary in the Torah, we see that the first mitzvah that was given to Am Yisrael was the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. An interesting question is, what does that mean to have a mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh? And the Torah itself tells us that the pasuk, the passage in Exodus 12:12, which I forgot to bring here, says, "HaChodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodeshim, Rishon hu lachem lechodshei hashana," that this month is the beginning of the month, and it shall be the first month of you for you to count as the beginning of the cycle of the month. So that is the passage in 12:12. So what does that actually mean, and what mitzvah do we have? Before we go into those details, let's take a step back. And we'll talk very shortly about the lunar and the solar and what they represent. Let's have a look at the Gemara in the Talmud Bavli in Chulin. It says the following. It says, Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi raises a contradiction between two verses. It is written, both of the verses are in Genesis, and it says there that God made the two great lights. And in the same verse, it says, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. In other words, already in the pasuk of the creation of the two lights, we have two great lights. We have the sun and we have the moon. So at the beginning, it says that there were two great lights. And then in the same verse, it says we have one which is bigger and one which is smaller. So Reb Shimon ben Pazi explains, when God first created the sun and the moon, they were equally bright. Then the moon said before the Holy One, the Master of the universe, is it possible for two kings to serve with one crown? One of us must be subservient to the other. God therefore said to her, the moon, if so, go and diminish yourself. So in a fascinating discussion almost between the sun and the moon come before God, and they both say and they turn with a claim, and they say, well, you can't actually have two kings, you can't have two rulers at the same time. So God, you have to choose between us, between the sun and the moon. So the moon comes and says this to God. So God says, you know what, you're right. Go and make yourself smaller. So it's almost like a parody. It's almost like a comical discussion. But obviously, when the Talmud is bringing this forward, what does that mean? And I think it brings forward the question of our relationship and a different relationship that we have between the sun and the moon. The sun can be considered and is considered according to, it's discussed in length and in depth in Chassidut, the sun is more masculine. The sun is the one who is giving the light. The moon is the feminine. The moon is the one who is receiving the light. And already in the Talmud, there's a discussion here of which one is greater. Well, I don't know if we had that discussion today. Obviously, the woman is greater. But back then in the Talmudic days, to have such a discussion is maybe a surprise. But let's look at if we look at the difference between them, the sun is a constant light. It has a constant schedule. It has a constant placing. You have the sunrise in the morning, the sun set in the evening, and you have 365 days that look basically the same. Maybe in the Nordic countries, we can see the differences of the different seasons, but basically you say, okay, well, the sun, this is how it is. Whereas the moon is constantly changing. Every single day is different. In that sense, also, there's a difference in spirituality between where do I place myself? Am I like the sun? Am I the one who is giving? And that should be constant? Or is it different in my reception, that I'm a different person as I receive differently each day? And the Talmud actually says, following this discussion, something quite incredible. On Rosh Chodesh, one of the things that we have, and we're going to discuss this when we get into the practical details, but in following an important understanding regarding prayer is that on a regular day, we have three different prayers, right? We have, if we follow the days, so the day begins when the night falls. The first prayer of the day is Ma'ariv, is the evening prayer. The second prayer of the day is Shacharit, even though many will think of it as the first prayer because it's the prayer of the morning. And then the third prayer of the day is Mincha. That cycle means we see that very clearly on Shabbat, for example, right? That we begin the Shabbat evening, when the sun sets, that's when the new day begins. On a regular day, we have those three tefillot, which are constant, like the sun, like we were discussing before. So we have the Shacharit, we have the Arvit or Ma'ariv, two names for the same, right? Which means the evening prayer. We have the Shacharit, the morning prayer, and then Mincha is the afternoon. So those three prayers, the Talmud discusses that they also follow sacrifices or offerings that were given at the temple, and our prayers are a replacement for the offerings that used to be in the temple. The Torah commands us to do regular offerings every day in the Mikdash, in the temple. So we had the Shacharit, we had a Tamid Shel Shachar, we had an offering in the morning, we had an offering of the Mincha in the afternoon, and then in the evening, there was basically nothing was allowed to be left over, so there was a burning, which was the completion of that third offering. On specific days, we had an additional offering that was supposed to be given. Those days are written in the Torah. One of those is Rosh Chodesh. So on Rosh Chodesh and on Shabbat and on all of the Chagim, the ones that come, the Yom Tov from the Torah, not the rabbinical ones, rather the ones from the Torah. On all of those days, we had an extra offering in the temple, which is written in the Torah and says the Torah teaches us how we should do it. Since the temple was destroyed and our tefillot and our prayers follow those offerings, therefore on those days we will have an additional prayer called Musaf. The Musaf means addition. So probably many of you already recognize that from the Shabbat prayer, in which we will have the Musaf prayer on Shabbat. But then you ask yourself, wait, when do I have Musaf? Do I have Musaf on Purim? No, because that's a rabbinical holiday. Do I have the Musaf of another prayer on Chanukah? No, because that's a rabbinical holiday. But Rosh Chodesh, for example, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, we jump over to Pesach. The Pesach, we have the 7 days of Pesach, an additional day in the diaspora, then Shavuot. So on all of those days, you will have an additional prayer called the Musaf. What you see here already is that the Musaf fits into the pattern of a holiday. In a sense, Rosh Chodesh, so the Rosh Chodesh fits into the pattern of the holidays. Rosh Chodesh in itself is a day of celebration. Even in Israel today, in the religious schools, from kindergarten up, everyone will go with a white shirt, like a Shabbat shirt, on Rosh Chodesh to school. So it's you. On the one hand, you can do. You don't have any prohibitions regarding what you can and cannot do, but it's a day of celebration. Now let's go back to the sense of the meaning of Rosh Chodesh and why it's a day. Why is it celebrated? Because as we said, it's just a day that sets our calendar. So why is it so important? So on the day of Rosh Chodesh, the sacrifice was actually called a sacrifice of forgiveness. Rosh Chodesh is an opportunity for renewal, to restart. The moon symbolizes for us that as the moon is starting its cycle again, we can start our lives again every single month. It's a point in which we can allow ourselves to look back. It's almost as if it's a little Yom Kippur, one can say. A day of retrospect, to look back at the last month and to say, where am I and what can I improve? The moon teaches us that because the moon starts from zero and starts building itself up again until it's the full moon. But in an interesting sense, the full moon is always in the middle of the month, and then it's a downhill from there until it restarts again. So the restarting point is the point of hope. The restarting point is when we can actually say, now I can build myself up again. And it's very interesting, if you look at the calendar, at the Hebrew calendar, the Chagim, the big Chagim are when there is a full moon. For example, Pesach, Seder night, it's not by chance. And it's very important to understand the Jewish calendar in this way, that since we're following the lunar cycle, I promise you that every time you step out of Seder night and look up in the sky, you will see a full moon. It's not by chance, because that's celebrating that moment in which, and it's not by chance, because when Am Yisrael left Egypt, they followed the full moon into the desert. You ask yourself, how were they walking out into the desert in the middle of the night? Well, there you have your answer. So it's this sense of that fullness, which is a celebration that I've reached something, right, that I've managed to renew myself in a sense. And when you look at Rosh Hashanah is the only one that actually begins on Rosh Chodesh itself. Because Rosh Hashanah is the beginning, and the beginning is never full. The beginning is always something that is building up. From the beginning, you start with 0, and then you build up to your full moon. In that sense, I think it's very obvious now why we said that the moon is feminine, because that sense of the feminine is obviously connected to the woman and to that cycle or that period that follows the monthly cycle as well. In other words, this idea of having the gift of life inside of yourself, which follows a cycle and reaches its full period and then starts over again with that promise of life once again. In a spiritual sense, the women were always the center of Rosh Chodesh. There's a special holiday for women on Rosh Chodesh, and the Shulchan Aruch even brings down a custom in which women, unlike men, did not work at all on Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh were for women like Shabbat. And it's brought down in the Shulchan Aruch till this day, but you see that custom sort of got forgotten over time. If we just take a look, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the sheet here. If we look at the Shulchan Aruch itself, it says about Rosh Chodesh, Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim 417:1. On the beginning of the month, it is permitted to do work. However, those women who follow a custom to not engage in work are following a good custom. The Ashkenazi tradition, the Rama is added here in italics. The Rama is always, the Shulchan Aruch was set in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, and then the Rama adds, okay, what are we doing in the Ashkenazi countries? So he says, and if the custom is to do some kinds of work and not do some other kinds of work, we follow the custom. In other words, you can see from this discussion here that in Ashkenazi countries, apparently there were different customs that were being followed. If we go back to the shiur that we had on customs, this is a very good example. Because in certain communities, women were not doing anything. They would take the day off in order to celebrate Rosh Chodesh, because it's a celebration, a feminine celebration. Whereas, as you see over time, maybe women were not privileged, they had to be working, they couldn't take the time off in the same sense. So the Rama is telling us, well, there are certain customs, and he doesn't list them, that certain places are following, that obviously you should follow the custom, which is customary wherever you are. So I would say that today, most of this has gotten, it does not follow until this day, these type of customs. But what is important is that we realize that it's actually a chag, that it's a holiday, because it's a holiday of renewal. I think this sense of renewal also has been coming, I think, all the way back to the 70s until today, when you had this idea of renewal. There was even a renewal movement in the United States, which tried to bring spirituality messaging into the Torah. So there was into Judaism. There was a lot of focus on Rosh Chodesh, because it really gives us a sense of renewal, of allowing ourselves to restart again, to allow ourselves to have that reflection. The moon is a type of reflection which touches us deep inside. Like I once heard a shiur on Rosh Chodesh from a rabbi, and he said, well, I haven't seen two people holding hands and staring up at the sun. In other words, right, there's something deep which touches you deep inside, looking up at the moon, the fact that you have the light in the night, the fact that you have this darkness and then this light coming into the darkness is all connected to the idea of Rosh Chodesh. But even more fascinating, the Talmud in if we go back to that same Talmudic discussion, it brings a fascinating idea about this idea of the moon and the sun. So it says as following: God saw that the moon was not comforted. In other words, God says, you know what? I'm going to make you bright, but you're not going to be as big as the sun. So God saw that the moon was not comforted. The Holy One, blessed be He, said, bring atonement for me since I diminished the moon. And this is what Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, what is different about the goat offering of the new moon? That it is stated with regard to it, for the Lord. The Holy One, blessed be He, said, this goat shall be an atonement for me having diminished the size of the moon. If we think about this, it's actually an incredible statement by the Talmud saying God made a mistake and He's asking for forgiveness for His mistake. God says, I made the moon smaller and bring a sin offering for me for the fact that I made the moon small. We don't have time to get into all of that, but I brought a commentary on that from Rabbi Nachman of Breslev, who explains the following. He says, we see His compassion in that for our benefit, He specified that Rosh Hashanah, the day of judgment, should fall on the new moon. This is really a great kindness, for how could we be so presumptuous to ask for forgiveness from God? He was therefore kind to us and set the day of judgment, Rosh Hashanah, on the new moon, when God Himself, as it were, seeks forgiveness, as in bring an atonement offering on my behalf, which was said in connection to the new moon. So we are not embarrassed to ask for forgiveness on the day of judgment, since He Himself asks for forgiveness then. In other words, this whole idea of compassion of forgiveness means that God says, you know what? There was a process here as well. We started out with two big lights, and for your sake, I made the moon smaller so that you can feel it is relating to you. So to sum this up, and we can have a long discussion on this, but the sun is a perfect light, but so perfect that we can't actually look at it. Similar to Moses coming down from Mount Sinai and his face so strong, glowing, that we could not even look at him. So on the one hand, you have to have a shining light in order to all the time tell you, you have to strive forward, you have to be better. On the other hand, sometimes, I don't know if any of you had the experience, but sometimes our experience in life is we meet people who are too perfect for us. They're not friends, and we feel that they would be the last people we would share our faults with. So God, in His compassion, made the moon smaller so that it's relatable to us. God says, you know what? I'm a bit sorry I made the moon smaller. And in that sense, He gives us, it makes it relatable for us to come forward and ask for forgiveness as well. So on the one hand, we need the sun, which is this constant light to show us that we have to constantly drive forward with who we are and with our aspirations in life. On the other hand, to be true to ourselves, to reflect on where we actually need to improve. And we do that through Rosh Chodesh. We do that through the moon. We do that through the feminine, through the receiving one another. I think it's also an issue of friendship as well, to reach out to one another like the moon and not like the sun, right? That we can be there for one another in that same way. So Rabbi Nachman of Breslev says that's why Rosh Hashanah comes out on Rosh Chodesh, because Rosh Hashanah is a day in which we could be so ashamed of ourselves. How could we ever come to God and say, I'm sorry for what I have done? Because we knew that it was wrong when we were doing it. So, and God saw that as well. But the fact that it is on Rosh Chodesh allows us this merciful feminine side of it, of compassion, saying, I receive you, I love you for who you are. I wish we had more time to go into this, but I want to go a bit into the practical details of Rosh Chodesh, and just to go through the understanding of when Rosh Chodesh is, and then the prayers themselves, and then some additions to the prayers as well. Just maybe we can take a slight pause. If anyone has any reflections or anyone wants to share on what we've said so far, you're welcome to do so.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Why is it that on Pesach we have these two Seder days? I understand that has to do with the risk of mistaking on the day, but the moon is the same all over the world. So how can one mistake on the day?
Fantastic question, and it will lead up it leads us actually into the understanding, okay, of the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. So I will actually begin. We can begin in an answer and a reply to your question, and then we'll get into some more details. The mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh itself, at the time as it was set, was to count according to the moon. What used to happen at the time of the temple was that people would be waiting to see the new moon. You didn't have a calendar which was set, which was telling you this is Rosh Chodesh and this is when Rosh Chodesh is. And you would have to testify according to you're seeing the moon. On the other hand, there was great scientific knowledge by the Sanhedrin, by the Supreme Court in Jerusalem, and they knew exactly where the moon was going to be. So there was a delicate balance between the fact that it had to be seen, there had to be testimony to it being seen, to the fact that they knew where and when it was going to be. We know that because what would happen was that the Supreme Court would be sitting in Jerusalem and waiting for people to come to tell them they had seen the moon. And maybe from a specific angle, it could be seen first, where it wouldn't be seen elsewhere. The first people to see the first sliver of the moon would go on a race to Jerusalem, okay? And it was almost like a competition. Who is going to make it first? And they were celebrated because the whole Jewish calendar was set by you seeing the moon. But the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court, were not naive. So they would investigate these people. Where did you see it? From what angle did you see it? How did it look like? But it left an opening because the days are not exact, because it is feminine. So because it's almost, you're trying to make something exact, which is not so exact. When is it seen? Where has it been seen? It can actually fall on one of 2 days. We see something very similar because the Muslim tradition till this day follows this exact practice. You can look in Google and write, when will Ramadan be? But if you ask a Muslim scholar, when will it be? He will quite uncertainly say, well, it might be on this day or this day. It's on one of 2 days. So it's exactly the same because it doesn't fit a Google calendar. It fits when the moon is actually seen. So it could be on this day or on this day. So that tradition is followed until this very day because the Muslim tradition follows the lunar cycle alone. What would happen was that in perhaps the most, the earliest technology of SMS messaging, what they would do is as soon as they decided that it was Rosh Chodesh, that these people had passed their investigation, they would light up huge bonfires, and they would have bonfires set and specific on the highest hills in Jerusalem. But imagine that by the time of the beginning of the first century, Jews had been quite spread out. So how do you get the message out to the Jews who are out in Jordan, who are out in Babylon, who are out in Iraq? So they would have this messaging system in which they would pass the bonfires on from one to another. Why is it so important? Exactly for what Lois has asked now. Because imagine that you are not celebrating Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur on the right day. You got it wrong by a day. And then a day later, they told you, well, you just fasted on the wrong day. You have to do another one. Well, that's not right. You haven't done everything on the right day. So Shabbat follows the weekly cycle. So you can never get it wrong. Every seventh day is Shabbat. Whereas all of these, because we have 29 I don't remember the number, but the number that is written in the Talmud of the lunar cycle was checked by NASA and is exact to the decimal point. I think it's 5 or 6 points. And NASA could not understand how the Talmud could have such detailed understanding of astronomy. But so you have, since it's not perfect, it's not a round number, so it actually could be on it could be on 1 of 2 days. Being so, when you had this system in which you can pass this messaging along, then people knew when it was. But when you no longer had that, and they had to set a calendar, which actually doesn't fit, because a calendar is very linear, right? It follows a specific pattern. It doesn't allow for those fluctuations. Therefore, you end up with the situation in which those who were no longer in Israel, or who were outside of Israel, no longer knew which day it would be on. So when they had to set the calendar, setting the calendar is not what the Torah wanted, because you should be following. This is a fact that we were put into exile, forced upon us something which should not be. So therefore, when in the diaspora until this day, you will have 2 days of every single holiday, not only Seder night, because they're not sure when it was going to be. So out of uncertainty, you have 2 days instead of 1. Go back or come around and close the circle. This was followed for all of the years in exile. But the Jews today coming back to the Holy Land canceled this custom because they went back to how it should be. So that's why till this day, in this day, we have 1 day of Sukkot, of the beginning of Sukkot. We have 1 Seder night in Jerusalem, in Israel, but outside we'll have 2 Seder nights. One can easily say, well, since we know it, we should cancel it in the rest of the world. But then we go back to the minhag and what we discussed about customs, and it's very difficult to cancel customs that have been followed for so long. So when you come into a new situation in which you're in Israel, so you can do that, but you still follow the customs that was actually set out of uncertainty of when the actual day will be. So you end up keeping Pesach, the beginning of Pesach, we have 2 days that we don't do milacha, that we don't do the work which is prohibited on Shabbat. We have 2 days at the end of Pesach, when in Israel it would be 1 day and 1 day. If I asked you how many days of Pesach are there, how many days do we have in Pesach? Anyone? Cecilia, you're saying 8? And if you're in Pesach, if you're in Israel this year, how many days of Pesach will you have?
7.
You will have 7. Okay, so that explains, and look at that difference between the two, because that's that difference of that follows that of how Rosh Chodesh used to be. And we have this a beautiful story of King David and when he was not yet king, and the celebration of King Saul of Rosh Chodesh. They would have a huge celebratory feast on Rosh Chodesh, and David does not show up at the feast, and then he sends his dear friend Jonathan to the feast to check out, and he understands very fast that he's trying to kill him. So we have that, as we see from that story as well, that they would have this beautiful feast on Rosh Chodesh itself. So Rosh Chodesh this today is we've taken, you can say we've lost the mitzvah as it used to be. We need the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court in Jerusalem, in order to do that. So we no longer have people running and in a competition to set the day. We're following our scientific astronomical knowledge of when it should actually be. Therefore, what we have is we will have the calendar is set. It has to be set according to specific days. So it ends up, as we said, we have 354 days. 354 days also doesn't split up perfectly. So we end up with months in which you have 30 days to the month, and you have months which are 29 days to the month. Okay, I know you can count on your fingers, maybe January, February. I don't remember how that works with the Gregorian calendar of the 30 and 31, and now we have 28. But that is it's a similar understanding of how the year has to be split up, so it actually works. So tell me if you follow me or if I've lost you. But the 29 days, okay, once we have 29 days in the month, the following day will be the first day of Rosh Chodesh, okay? Will be Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the next month. When we have 30 days, okay, when we have 30 days of the month, means we have an extra day at the end of the month. So it actually could be the 30th, or it could be the 1st. We have that same uncertainty that we have with Seder if we're out there in the middle of Babylon and have no connection to Jerusalem and don't know when it will be. So when we have 29 days in the month, everyone understands that the next day is Rosh Chodesh. But when we have 30 days in the month, people might not know if the 30th day is Rosh Chodesh, is the first of the next month, or whether it's the last day or the first day of the next month. Take this month, for example. This month of Adar has 30 days to it. Therefore, the actual first day of the next month, of the second month of Adar, will be on Friday. If you look at your Jewish calendars, you will see that the first day of the month is this coming Friday. However, since we have an additional day that has been added to it according to our calculation, it creates it could create a misunderstanding because people could think it's Rosh Chodesh. Therefore, because of that uncertainty, we'll have 2 days of Rosh Chodesh. So this week, for example, we have 2 days of Rosh Chodesh, which is on Thursday and on Friday. When is the first day of the next month? It's on Friday. But because of the uncertainty and because it's an additional day, we have an additional day of Rosh Chodesh as well. If anyone followed me, please say so. If you need me to clarify, please let me know if that was clear enough. Okay, I'm surprised. That was a bit difficult. Okay, so again, this anytime that we have 30 days in the Hebrew month, the last day will be Rosh Chodesh, and then the following day will be Rosh Chodesh as well. How do you know when Rosh Chodesh actually is? You'd have to go to shul. Why? Because you don't have to. You can just print out a calendar, and it will say, it will tell you this is 2 days of Rosh Chodesh. Even in Google Calendar, you can add Hebrew holidays, and it will give you that you can add it as well, I think, because it is a holiday, as we said. But if you go to shul on the Shabbat before the Rosh Chodesh, they will say there's a special prayer said in which it's a beautiful prayer. I highly suggest that you open your Sidurim and have a look at this prayer. It's a prayer in which we all stand and bless the coming month, that it be filled with blessings and peace and prosperity and all of that. You will find it just before Musaf prayer in your Siddur. And I can also add it to the summary that we'll be sending out for the shiur, so you can have a look at it. Part of that prayer will be actually telling the congregation Rosh Chodesh will fall this next week on the following days, because not everyone follows their calendar either. So this Shabbat, we were in the shul just before the Musaf. We had this additional prayer, and in this additional prayer, it's called Shabbat Mivarchim. The whole Shabbat is called the Shabbat of blessing, because in a sense, it's a special Shabbat filled with blessing because you're excited that the new month is coming. And it's filled with blessing because we are blessing the next month. So if any of you have ever seen in your community calendars where it says Shabbat Mivarchim means this is Shabbat before Rosh Chodesh, in which we will bless the coming month. And then in Shul we said Shabbat Rosh Chodesh Adar Sheni, the second month of Adar, will be on Thursday and on Friday this coming week. Let's talk a little about Rosh Chodesh itself. So what happens on Rosh Chodesh? We mentioned it's like a holiday, it's a special day, it's a day of renewal. We, as I said, many people will dress up special because it's Rosh Chodesh, it's like Shabbat. And let's go through the prayers themselves. What we have is addition to the prayers themselves, is that in every Shmona Esrei, in every Tfilat Amidah, in the silent prayer throughout the day, in Arvit, in Shacharit, and in Mincha, we will add a special prayer that we add on holidays as well. The name of the prayer is Ya'aleh V'yavo. Where will this be in the Siddur? Well, different people here have different Siddurim, but if you open up your Siddur, let's just see, does everyone have a Siddur there? Do you have a Siddur that you can quickly get? I can share if anyone doesn't have, let's just share a Siddur here. I'm just going to share a Siddur from online, but I want you to look at it, have a look afterwards. So if I'm just looking at a weekday, and I open up the Amidah, so if towards the end of the Amidah, we have something called Ritzeh. It's just before Modim when we bow down, for those of you who are more familiar with the Amidah, but we'll have a better chance to go through the Siddur and learn it as part of the Shiurim. But what you see here is that in the middle of the Amidah, suddenly it has a prayer here called Ya'aleh V'yavo. And this prayer is added in the middle of the Amidah, and then in the middle of it, it will say, we will add an additional prayer for Rosh Chodesh. Those of you who can read the Ivrit, so here we say, Ya'aleh V'yavo, and may God, when you remember us and redeem us and give us grace and kindness and mercy and peace, and we add the words B'yom Rosh HaChodesh Hazeh, on this day of Rosh Chodesh. So basically, every single tefillah, we have the regular tefillah. We're going to add the tefillah. We're going to do the regular tefillah of Arvit, Shacharit, and Mincha. And if you're at home as well, so when you do the Amidah, you're going to add the Ya'aleh V'yavo to the Amidah. Okay? Second thing that we have is in the morning service, we have a special tefillah, which is a prayer of grace. The name of this prayer is called Hallel. The Hallel is also something that we say on holidays, but as we said, Rosh Chodesh is a holiday. It's a prayer of thanksgiving. Many times it's sung, And something unique, especially in today, is that you will have special Rosh Chodesh musical prayers. Why? Because you can't play music on a holiday, on a Yom Tov in Shul, but on Rosh Chodesh you can. So they actually have beautiful Rosh Chodesh gatherings in which they will have a musical Hallel, in which there's lots of singing and dancing, which is a beautiful celebration. But even for those who don't have that, we have this Hallel, which is added in Shacharit immediately after the Amidah. Okay? Another thing that we're going to add, and we're talking about on a regular day, for example, this coming Thursday, is that after the Hallel service, if we have a minyan, if we're at the synagogue, we will have a special Torah reading. We'll take out the Torah, even though it's a regular day, it's not Shabbat, and we have a special reading for the Rosh Chodesh. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the shiur, we have an additional prayer called the Musaf. There's a special prayer for Musaf of Rosh Chodesh. So one last thing, and then I'm just going to do a cycle of all of the additions that we're adding to the Rosh Chodesh. The final thing is that the same Ya'aleh V'Yavo is added into the Birkat Hamazon as well, the grace after meals. So if you have eaten bread and you're saying Birkat Hamazon, in the Birkat Hamazon you will notice that it says on Rosh Chodesh, add this prayer itself. I'm just looking for my Birkon here. I can't see it here, but I have the Swedish version that we have in Malmo, and then in the bracha itself, it says in the third part, it's just before Uvenei Yerushalayim. It's in the third blessing, so to say, but it's and then we add an Ya'aleh V'Yavo. When you were learning the brachot, did you have a chance to go through Birkat Hamazon? Anyone? No recollection. Okay, so I want you to look at the Birkat Hamazon that you're used to saying from your Shabbat meal, and you will see that you have this addition to the grace after meals, which is called Ya'aleh V'Yavo, that you should add on Rosh Chodesh. So to sum up the additions that we have on Rosh Chodesh, first of all, we have the Ya'aleh V'Yavo that is added to the Amidah. We have in the morning after the Amidah of Shacharit, we have Ya'aleh V'Yavo in the Amidah, and then afterwards we have Hallel. We have the Torah reading, and then we have the Musaf, which we are adding to that. And throughout the day, we have the Ya'aleh V'Yavo, which is added whenever we're saying grace after meals. If we have washed our hands, then we have it in there. And if we're also saying the shorter version, which is called Al Michya, then we will have an addition there for Rosh Chodesh as well. So those are the technical details of when we're adding things into the Rosh Chodesh. As always, the best practice is to practice. So take your Siddur and just have a look at it yourselves so that you can say, okay, well, actually, we have Rosh Chodesh upcoming this Thursday. I want to be prepared for that. So what am I going to, even if I'm not going to synagogue or if we don't have services, what is it that I'm going to need to remember that I am adding to the tefillot throughout the day? And going back to the beginning, the first part of the shiur, it's a day of celebration, a day of reflection, a day of renewal, a day of forgiveness. And in that sense, we celebrate the fact that we can start afresh and shine like the reflection of the moon in that beautiful sense of the light coming out of the darkness. The last thing that just I said I was going to mention, but we can mention shortly, is that the whole fact that we have an additional month, an addition, yes, thank you, there's also a short addition. You're right, 100%. At the end of Birkat Hamazon, there's a sentence we say, "Harachaman u'yichadesh alenu tachodesh hazeh." May God renew for us. It's connected to that sense of renewal. Again, the word for Rosh Chodesh, if it was not obvious from the beginning of this shiur, it's chadash means new. In other words, that every month is a chance for renewal, and that we are renewing ourselves through the month. And so we have an addition at the end of Birkat Mazon as well. So you can have a look at that, look at the Birkat Hamazon, try to see where we're adding for Rosh Chodesh. The last point I wanted to make is that the whole idea is that we're balancing between the lunar and the solar year. That's where we started off. We have two lights. We have the sun and the moon that God created. And in that sense, so that balance is created through an additional month that is added to compensate for the extra 11 days difference between the two. Why is that? If you look at the Muslim tradition, the Ramadan, they're following the lunar cycle. So every year it's going to go 11 days backward into backwards because they've lost 11 days. So, for example, if Ramadan was in the summer a few years ago, now it's gone backwards, and it will be at the beginning of our month of Nisan, a month from now. The next year it will be even going farther back, etc., because they're just following the lunar cycle, so it has nothing to do with the seasons. It makes it much easier for them, for example, if it's in the winter because they're fasting, and someone in it could be that many Muslims will immigrate to Lapland when it comes the smack middle of the winter, because then they will only be fasting maybe 2 hours. Whereas if it's in the middle of the summer, then you can have 19 hours because it's not seasonal, as I said. The Torah sets Rosh Chodesh, and this goes back to the psukim that we saw in Exodus, chapter 12, that the Torah sets the commandment of setting our Hebrew calendar so that it is both lunar and seasonal as well, which does not make so much sense. Because Pesach is when we left Egypt in the spring, but it has to remain in the spring, because the whole idea of Pesach is blossoming like flowers. It's going out of Egypt, and you cannot have that in the middle of the winter. It has to be just when it is spring, because it is called the festival of the spring. So how can we have it both at the same time? How can you have both it lunar and solar? So the system was set so that the lunar and solar meet each other every 19 years. That's a scientific fact. So since they meet each other every 19 years, you set a system so that you compensate for those 11 days, okay? Within the 19 years, you end up with 7 additional months. So that once, according to the specific system set for it, but every few years, when we're losing track, then we add an additional month at the end of the year, so that we end up with 2 months of Adar. It's a longer conversation that we won't take up now, but I was just explaining why we have it specifically this year. So this coming week, on Thursday and Friday, in other words, whenever we set the Hebrew date, it means it starts at the end of sunset the previous day. So from Wednesday night until Shabbat begins, we will have 2 days of Rosh Chodesh. So that all of everything we spoke about, which is added to Rosh Chodesh, are added from Wednesday night. In other words, if I'm having dinner on Wednesday night and I'm sitting down, I already have to think to myself, wait, what am I adding to the tefillot, to the Birkat Hamazon, or to Al HaMichya that I'm saying at the end of the meal? Then to prepare myself for the special tefillot that we will have on Thursday morning, and which are the Hallel and the Musaf, and then on Friday as well. If we have service in the synagogue, it's always easier to follow because then we will see it with our own eyes. If not, then just do your best to prepare yourself so that you know in advance what you should have. As I said, I'm going to send a summary of the PDFs of the books that we have that you can follow. So as a summary of this shiur. We went through both trying to balance this meaning as well as the practical details. I hope it wasn't too much for you today. Any questions? You're welcome. Bivakasha.
I have a question about the Hallel.
Yes.
It says in my Oslo Siddur that we read half Hallel, Chatzi Hallel.
Mm-hmm.
How far do we then read?
So there's
what are the specific last words?
Yeah, I didn't mention that because I felt there was a bit too much, but it's good that you're asking because it means you followed. Good. The Hallel itself, there's two types of Hallel. We have one thing, something called the complete Hallel. The wording used there, which is the half Hallel, is not exactly precise. What it just means is that we have two paragraphs within the Hallel that we will skip on specific days. And you will just see it in the Hallel. We won't go into it, but you will just see that it says on Rosh Chodesh and on specific days of Pesach, for example, we're going to skip these following two paragraphs. It's right in the middle of the Hallel. If you look there at the third paragraph and then at the fifth.
I know.
Yeah, so skip one page forward. Yeah, so the top paragraph that you see there, which is called Lo Lano, you'll see, can you just read the top, what it says in italics for everyone?
On the top?
Yeah.
Lo Lano Adonai, Lo Lano, Ki Leshimcha Ten Kavod, Al Chastecha, Al Amitecha.
Yeah, so what are the directions that it says? It will say above that, in Norwegian, I assume, that on Rosh Chodesh, we're going to skip the following paragraph, correct?
Yes.
And then if you look two paragraphs further down.
Yeah, also to skip.
Also to skip. That's the meaning of what they're calling half Hallel.
So the two first one, I read them.
And then you continue on. You're doing the whole Hallel and just skipping two paragraphs. All you're doing, you're reading the whole thing, just skipping over two paragraphs.
Okay.
Okay, great. Any further questions? Okay. I assume that silence is good. Does it mean that anyone understood anything today? I hope so. I hope we managed to also, and I realize for someone who's not familiar at all, it's quite a lot, but all it means is that you need to go and open up and practice for yourself. And there's a recording of this shiur as well, so you can open up your books and follow along anything that was unclear to you. And I will send the summary as well with the PDFs. Hopefully, Rav Yoav will also have a special shiur next week, either next week or the following. We want to prepare you properly for Purim. So, and go into the practical mitzvot that we need to be doing as well. I will let you know in the email that we're sending out the plan for the upcoming 2 weeks, because we had Purim, we have to prepare for Purim, and we had another subject as well. But I'll give you an update in the email that you will receive. So hope everyone had a good coffee, and you can have another one after the shiur. You definitely deserve it. I'm going to have another one, and have a fantastic week, and hopefully see you both on Wednesday, the shiur, and next week as well. So, Shavua Tov lekulam, להתראות, shalom, shalom.